what they call the feminization of the education system. More and more teachers became women, especially in rural areas. So between the 1820s and the 1830s, they had what they call common schools, which became our public school system. And they kind of sprang up everywhere. Because there weren't enough men to teach in these schools, they actually decided to start hiring more women. But they were very specific on the type of woman. There was actually a sentinel standing at the threshold who would watch and make sure she was properly dressed. She reflected their moral values from head to toe.
Mm-hmm.
And this was upside down. You can see it very well done.
What time did the original, the other one that was put, it probably just took more time for the picture.
Yeah, but I think they're sideways.
Oh.
But maybe those would be easier to see if it's sideways. What do you think? Meanwhile, I'll go on. So, and the education was, the purpose of the education then was they wanted to teach children a moral value system based on Republican with a small r ideals. And basically they taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and Latin. If you notice, they actually segregated the students. The boys were on one side, the girls were on the other. The younger children were in the front of the classroom, and the older kids were in the background. Also, the older children were the ones that the teacher really interacted with more, and then they would teach the younger students. They were funded by either, this became a free public school system in a way. They were funded by taxes, or some parents would have to pay. But the common schools led to a demand for better educated teachers since there were so many of them. So that started the normal school system. Normal school would be sort of equivalent to our high school. Because most of the teachers had maybe up to an 8th grade education. So they felt like if they were teaching to the 8th grade, then they would need, obviously teaching here to have more education. So they would probably have another 2 or 3 years of education. The children who, the younger children that were learning, the ones, let's say, 5 to 10 years old, they called them ABCdarians because they were basically learning their ABCs. So in our area, this first school was the Hartford School, and that was built in started out in 1805. It was on Schoolhouse Lane. They sat on benches without backs. There was a wood stove in the middle of the classroom. That's the school. They sat on benches. There was a wood stove. The boys actually, part of their duty when they came to school was to start to carry in the firewood for the day, and then the boys and girls took turns carrying in water for the classroom, and they actually drank out of one tin cup, the whole class. So that was pretty much what the education was like between the 1820s and the 1840s. Beginning in the 1840s, it was more common to see a woman in the classroom than a man, except for like in the higher education, you would have some schoolmasters. But they were, the teachers were still pretty young. Most of them were maybe only 14 or 15 years old, so they had some discipline problems probably in the classroom. Some of the older students might have been even older than their teachers, or some of these boys especially were probably taller, bigger, especially like the farmers' sons. Education back then, they tried to plan the schools about 4 to 5 miles apart. They felt that was walking distance. They went to school for about 132 days of the year, and depending on harvest time, and maybe about 59% attendance rate on a regular basis. School day was between 9 to either like 2 or 4 p.m. I think in the winter hours they probably came home earlier when it got dark. They had an hour for lunch. They would like, that would be their recess time. They are having recess, standing on their heads. They used in the classroom slate and chalk. They didn't have paper or pens. As I said before, to the older students learned from the teacher, and then they went and taught the younger students. I think it was their way also of kind of discovering there might be a potential teacher in that group who would move on. Because most of the teachers only taught until they were married. And so it'd be a few years, they married young, so maybe 2 or 3 years, and then they would move on. There's a lot of stories about some of the teachers in the individual schools back then. It was quite a trip for them just to get here on a daily basis. Most of them lived like in the Mount Holly area. So they would have to take a train to Medford. They would then be met by one of the residents here in Indian Mills, and by wagon they would come into the school. So, I mean, their day could actually begin like 6 in the morning because it took them, so many hours to get actually even just to the school. And they were paid early on, about $10 to $15 a month. Now, some teachers actually did board with residents. And sometimes that worked out and sometimes it didn't, depending on the family they were living with. But that would save them on their commute time and made it more of a worthwhile trip for them. The women, this was the beginning of actually a women's movement to work and become independent. So even though they weren't making as much money and their conditions weren't the easiest, they kind of liked the freedom that they had, and they were earning their own money. So around this time we see the schools here. That's a typical family in front of one of their homes. Father, mother, 3 or 4 children. Not all the children would go to school at the same time. Usually the boys probably had less schooling than the daughters did. But, they try to give them regular school hours. That is the, I think that's the Hartford School. That's that was the Free Soil School that later became known as the Baker School. And that burned down. It became, I think they rebuilt it and then it burned down. It became a house, and there's none of these one-room schools left in the area except for one. So in addition to just the chore to get to the school and to get the school open, they were also responsible for the upkeep. Some of these buildings got pretty run down. A lot of people didn't want to spend a lot of money on schooling. They felt, it's kind of almost like a luxury to some families to send their children to school. So it was, it was a little bit difficult for them. But they persevered.
That's the Baker School.
That's the Baker School.
Yep.
That's the second one that was built on that site. I think the Baker School is the one where the Wawa is now.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was, the land was donated by Crane.
Yep, so the Baker School is what became the Free, they used to call it the Free Soil School. That was school number 91, built in the 1850s. That became a private home, then was abandoned, and then burned down by the fire department, actually. And originally there were 5 one-room schoolhouses in Indian Mills. So this is the only surviving one-room schoolhouse. It's at Science School, and it's actually still there.
Who knows how long?
When was that built?
That was built in 1872. It was torn down. The original school was built in 1872. It was torn down. That was rebuilt in 1913. It was a little larger. They actually only used that for 5 years. That's why it's still standing. It was one of the last schools built. They only used it for 5 years, and then they were actually starting to bring all the students into the old Indian Mill School, which was, they were preparing Indian Mill students to go, into one school. The whole town would be attending one school at that time. These are a couple children bringing their lunch to school. There were no lunch programs. There was no cafeterias or anything like that. They brought their lunch to school in a tin can. This is the discipline. So they were disciplined. They believed in corporal punishment. In the earlier days, they were actually, they could be lashed. They would have to write 100 times, "I will not," whatever. There was a famous dunce cap. And they could be, spanked. Or hit on their fingers with a ruler. So, these are some of the early class. I have these pictures, so we can look at these later on, but that's some of the classrooms here in Indian Mills. That's about 1825, I think I saw. I thought it was interesting, they almost all have the same hairstyle, boys or girls. This is a little later, I think this might be the 1930s. And this is about the same time period. This is a later edition. This would have been like an early 1950s maybe. They actually had now blackboards in the classroom, and more materials were being given out to the students. As far as most kids by the 8th grade were done with schooling, but if they were lucky enough, they could go on to high school. So in this area, the only high school at one time was just, actually before it became Mount Holly High School, it was called the West Jersey Collegiate Institute. It was just for boys. It was started by Samuel Miller in 1845. It actually was built on the same site that Rancocas Valley High School is on now. When they were building the high school, they found the foundation for this institute. And then in 1895, Mount Holly High School was really just a very simple educational process of just maybe giving the students another 2 or 3 years of education. But the increasing enrollment meant that they had to expand, and so in 1912, Mount Holly High School expanded and was constructed on Brainerd Street in Mount Holly. And then in 1937, RV was approved by the voters for a cost of $307,000 at 3.5% interest for about 750 students. So that's the early Rancocas Valley, when it was built in 1937. The only thing that's not changed is the interest rate. It's about 3.5% right now. And then, of course, they expanded into this building, still on the same site. And these are a little fuzzy, but this is the current iteration. They've added a couple wings. Lenape High School, by that time there were enough students in this region that built their own high school. So Lenape was built in 1958 after they actually established Lenape Regional District. And that started out with 548 students in just the freshman and sophomore class. These juniors and seniors stayed at Rancocas Valley. And then in 1975, Shawnee High School was built. And then after that was Seneca, that our students now go to. That was built in 2008. That's already 11 years ago. So that was basically, the foundation of our system that we have now. And again, all the other one-room schoolhouses are gone except for the one in Atzine Village. Any questions, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Mm-hmm.
The Atzine Schoolhouse is there now, but who knows how long.
Yeah.
Because I live next to it, it's constantly being broken into.
Yeah.
The state seems to want nothing to do, because I've reported it. Now you've got to catch the people. Well, I'm not a law enforcement person or anything else. And so I said, well, what about the rangers? Oh, they would have to be there when it's happening. And it's just a matter of time, and that will go up in smoke. Because we try to keep an eye on it, but there's too much undergrowth now between my place and the schoolhouse to get a clear view. And so people just pull down a bit, park, and go in there and vandalize. And so who knows how long it's going to.
Same thing happened to Cottonville in '77.
Yeah, the cotton mill, that's a whole story in itself too. Coincidentally, the state kept hauling in flammable liquids, and all of a sudden, whoop, it went up in smoke, completely destroyed one fire. Yeah.
What happened to the Etheridge house? Was that the,
Same thing, vandalism and everything else. The only place left standing was the little, it's got log siding, but it was really a clapboard house underneath it, where When I was a boy, a lady named Sue Cranmer lived there. But then later, the Lanes, who had a bar a little bit further up 206 in a place we call Dutchtown. Mrs. Lane and her kids lived there, and the husband stayed at the bar and the business. And when they moved out, it was rented maybe for a couple of years, and then that's it. It's sat vacant ever since. And that's being broken into constantly.
There was another, the Bailey house was another one?
That was my house.
Yeah, okay.
Because